All right, so thank you again for joining us. Tonight we're talking all about attachment with Pillars of Peace. If you attended any of our previous webinars that were more about relationship health, like the red flags, green flags presentation, we brought up attachment very briefly in that presentation. And so tonight we're going a little bit more in depth, but as always, we're trying to keep a focus on some practical information that really could be helpful to any individual, whether you're just trying to kind of work on yourself and your overall emotional and mental health, or whether you are dealing with something confusing in a relationship, or whether you're um, not necessarily confused about your relationship or worried about what's happening, but you would like to work on having a more secure attachment and connection within that relationship. We'll be sharing some tools that apply to all of those different situations. And there'll be opportunities throughout for you to ask questions and respond. So we do hope that you will, when we ask questions, that you will make use of the chat or unmute yourselves in order to participate. And also, if you see me pausing, particularly during the opening few minutes of our presentation, I apologize, but I'm just making sure that everybody's able to get in from the waiting room. And that does take my attention just for a second here and there. All right, so just a reminder of not just Tamanna and I are here tonight to share this information with you, and Tamanna will also be monitoring the chat and questions and facilitating the discussions. But we also have an additional case manager and advocate working with us named Adine Isatullah. So you might be seeing her at some of our other webinars in the future, or if you come to any of our in-person events. And both Tamanna and Adine are responsible for answering the calls to people who are calling that helpline number, and helping you figure out what resources you need and how we can help you. And collectively, we're able to offer services in several different languages, in Bangla, Urdu, English, obviously, Arabic, and French. So we hope that if you know of people who are in need of those services in those languages, that you make a particular effort to let them know about us and connect us, since we know sometimes the language barrier actually makes it harder to even find out about which services are available in the city. So we also wanted to let you know about some of the other things that we have going on. We're going to be talking tonight about some of the ways that our early childhood experiences can affect us and our ability to engage in healthy relationships with others, and to, be healthy ourselves. And so we wanted you to know that we are going to be starting a support group next month for young adults impacted by domestic violence in their families of origin. So that means you don't have to identify as a survivor yourself, but if there was any kind of domestic violence, power and control dynamics, abuse, it doesn't have to be physical abuse, financial abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse. If any of those things was going on in your family when you were growing up, we know that it can make it a little bit harder to navigate the next stages of adulthood and to figure out how to maybe move on to having a healthy relationship yourself, or just to kind of deal with the many impacts that that can have on your development. So we're hoping that any of you who that describes you, that you will visit that link. I think, Tamanna, if you can put the link, the sign up link in the chat, that would be helpful. And we would reach out to you to find out more, and then hopefully get the group started sometime in early February. We also have, before we go into the content of our of our presentation, we also want to remind you that this webinar is part of a series that we're starting now to do a webinar in the last 2 Tuesdays of every month. So there will be another presentation next Tuesday that will be on looking at the full spectrum of unhealthy relationships. So not just talking about what an abusive relationship looks like, but what happens when a relationship is high conflict, unhealthy, very disengaged, and how to deal with all these different situations. So we hope that you'll also join us for that. And if we can share in the chat the sign up link to that event as well. And then also to let you know about a workshop series that we're doing at the African Services Committee in Harlem, and that's actually in 2 languages, in both French and English. And you can visit either our Instagram page or the African Services Committee Instagram page to see more about the different topics that we'll be covering with them. But that's as part of a series on women's health that they're sponsoring, and our presentations are all dealing with different types of relationship health and emotional health issues and tools to deal with all of those concerns. So now that we've gotten through all the big announcements, let's get down to the reason why we're all here. So the reason why we're talking about attachment in the first place is because this is one of the big parts of the puzzle when it comes to figuring out having a healthy relationship with other people. And I say relationship in the broadest of terms. Our attachment issues come up the most in our most deep relationships where there's something at stake. So they definitely tend to come up in romantic relationships, in marriages, and intimate partnerships. But they can also come up in our other relationships, whether those are friendships that are very important to us, a relationship with a mentor or a parental figure, or even relationships with the people that we work with or a boss. So it's really important to understand what attachment style we have developed and how to get to a more secure place in order to figure out how to be healthy in our relationships with other people, and also to protect ourselves when we're dealing with people who are not able to be healthy with us. So we've shared a little bit of a general definition of the things that we don't want in a healthy relationship. We don't want power struggles. We don't want domination. We don't want contempt for the other person. And we want there to be mutual respect and collaboration and support. And we want there to be equality. But would anyone like to share a little bit more about what a healthy relationship means to you? Usually we have some idea of what a good relationship or a healthy relationship looks like, even if that's something that we've struggled to find for ourselves. So you can share your definition of a healthy relationship in the chat, or if you'd like, you can also unmute yourself, or I think you can raise your hand even. And we can unmute you if you'd like to speak up to the group.
We have a response in the chat. It says, healthy relationships involve honesty, trust, respect, and open communication between partners, and they take effort and compromise from both people.
Thank you, Sada. I think that's a really good definition, a good starting point for understanding what a healthy relationship can involve. So let's move on to the next slide. We talk a lot about the same kind of principles being essential to a healthy relationship. Because we are, at Pillars of Peace, we are working in the field of gender-based violence. So we always start from a place of safety, but safety is kind of like the bottom line. You have to have safety in order to have a healthy relationship. But safety by itself is obviously not enough to say that relationship is healthy and it's strong. There also needs to be a foundation of mutual respect between the partners. There needs to be accountability so that when we inevitably make mistakes, disappoint or hurt one another's feelings, that we're able to take responsibility for that and kind of own our part of the relationship. And there needs to be cooperation. There needs to be mutual support in both directions. There needs to be trust between the partners, and there needs to be honesty. And we also talk a little bit about the balance between things like honesty and trust, because it's really easy when you are in an unhealthy or even an abusive relationship for somebody to talk the talk about a lot of these words. But usually, what you'll find is that it's either kind of a one-way street where I expect my partner to be completely honest with me, even about things that maybe are either unimportant or that they can also expect to have some privacy around. And I say, you need to do all these things in order for me to trust you. But usually that same standard doesn't apply in the reverse. And even if it does, that creates a very tense environment for the relationship. So there's always a little bit of give and take where we need to be honest with one another, but we also need to be understanding of things like when you're starting a new relationship, you're not going to show up on the first day and, read off this person everything that's ever happened in your life in chronological order. Like you have a right to determine how much you feel comfortable sharing or what you feel like sharing at any point in the relationship. And there should be some understanding about that on both sides. So these are some of our ideas about what a healthy relationship involves. But for how many of us have we learned how to do this? How to be in a healthy relationship, how to behave in healthy ways? And if we did learn that, where did we learn it from? Who teaches us? Who teaches us how to behave in a healthy way with a partner? Any guesses or ideas from the group about how we all learn about being in a healthy relationship? Like, do you learn about it in school? Is there a class that you take that they're offering?
We have a response that says families or friends. Anybody else?
It's a good example. I want to hear more examples from the group.
The relationship our caregivers have with us. I assume that's the rest of it. And we also have life experiences with different people. Those are all like correct answers.
Yeah, I think we can go to
Yeah. And then we also have our parents, although they're not necessarily healthy.
right. We're learning from real people with all the variation that implies. So it's true, our parents are our first and our most important teachers about relationships. Whether our parents or whoever are those like primary caregivers in our lives. And what is so significant about our parents is not just how they model relationships with one another, but it's actually the type of the relationship that they have with us, which teaches us foundationally what to expect from other people. But obviously, that's not the only contributing factor, right? We might have other role models in our lives. Somebody mentioned friend, and also more generally, family. So, other people in your family, maybe somebody that you look up to, that you're observing as you grow up, and you're getting an idea about what relationships can look like, what be relationship behaviors are, what to expect from a partner, or even from a friend or a family member. And then we have our own experiences. So sometimes we can have really negative or positive experiences when we're first growing up, and those are very, very significant. But then our other experiences throughout life will also influence us in terms of what conclusions we draw about what relationships look like and how we can communicate with another person. And finally, nobody here mentioned the media, but it is kind of a contributing factor. Um, there are a lot of representations of romance and love and marriage in the media that we consume. And those can be very influential for us, particularly if we are lacking examples in other areas of our life. Um, those kind of fictionalized representations of relationships can have an influence on us, whether positive or negative. So going back to this key piece about our caregivers and their relationship with us being the most significant in teaching us what to expect from relationships. What happens when those teachers, our caregivers, were stressed out or distracted, or they were themselves violent, or they were themselves controlling, even if it wasn't necessarily out of a bad place? Maybe were fearful about the environment that we were living in, and so they were really tense a lot of the time. What kind of impact does that have um, on what we learn when those are the dynamics with our teachers? And again, you can respond in the chat, or if you're feeling brave, you can unmute yourself or raise your hand, and we would love to hear your voice.
We have a response that says that it is a normal response to be like stressed out or distracted or violent in response to.
So it sounds like, whatever our teachers or our caregivers are doing, that's what we're learning is normal in relationships. And so if the behaviors aren't negative or they're painful, we're learning that those negative and painful behaviors are normal. Any other responses? Even thinking about, like, if you just look at one specific example, like if they're normally very distracted, not kind of giving you their full attention, then what do you learn about relationships? Or if you want to contribute on the opposite side, what do you learn about relationships when your caregivers are loving and attentive and communicative?
I think this is Sarah, by the way.
Yeah,
I
thank
think
you.
yeah, sure. I agree with what Nia wrote in the chat. I feel like whether it's a negative response or positive, we kind of see that as like a model for behavior, especially when we're first exposed to these kinds of situations, and we see maybe this is the way that people are tend to react, which is why a lot of reactions and the ways that we learn about how to behave in a relationship can vary greatly among like different cultures and countries because this is what we're exposed to. Um, so if we see that someone is reacting in a very respectful, loving way, this is the environment that a certain individual was raised in, then they would be more likely to respond in that way, and not necessarily through like physical teachers, but also in the media as well.
Sure, and thank you so much for sharing that, Sada. I like that you use the word react. So you're learning how your caregivers and therefore what kind of how your caregivers react is the kind of reaction that you're most likely to expect from other people, because your caregivers are the first people that are teaching you about the world. And so their reactions kind of can teach you what to expect. Um, and this is why it isn't necessarily that we're 100% learning to do what our caregivers do, but um, we're learning how we can behave in order to deal with people who behave similarly to how our caregivers behave. So we'll go into more detail on this very soon, actually. So before we go into the kind of results of different types of parenting, I wanted to take a moment to just mention that there are kind of 4 distinct parenting styles. And this is without going into other than the uninvolved, but this is without somebody saying that this parent is necessarily neglectful in a way that is the child is being physically or medically neglected, or that the child is being physically abused. But there are these different variations in parenting styles. So people who are very authoritarian parents will focus a lot on obedience, punishment over discipline, and there might be a lot less kind of emotional support and communication. The big thing is that the child needs to know to just obey the parents and what they say. Um, and obviously, this can be more and less extreme, and there are a lot of reasons why parents might gravitate toward that parenting style, right? I mentioned parents that are in an environment where they're fearful. And so parents who are growing up in an environment where they're fearful or their parents were fearful, they tend to emphasize more obedience because of the fear that if this child is not under my control, I'm not going to be able to protect them. So it's not necessarily that they are mean or being hurtful to their children, but they're ending up with this parenting style, which does not pay a lot of attention to the child's needs or the emotions, but really focuses just on obedience and sort of punishment and discipline. Um, and then another kind of parenting style that we'll talk about is permissive. So often this is a reaction to people who had authoritarian parents. They're remembering that they felt unheard, they felt like they couldn't have a connection with their parents. Maybe they feared their parents more than they felt love and respect with them. And so they don't want to do that, but they might overcompensate, and they're very permissive and, not really enforcing rules, just kind of saying, oh, kids will be kids, and letting them behave however they might instinctively behave. And this, even though it looks more friendly and maybe nice to some people, it actually also tends to lead to a lot of distress for the child, because the child needs the parent to be a protective figure. And part of that protection is the parent setting boundaries and setting limits and creating structure around them. And when children don't have that, they can become very dysregulated, and they can actually feel afraid, even in environments where there's not any physical danger that's really in the way, but they're feeling that they've been kind of left with adult responsibilities, adult decision making that is too much for them. And then we'll talk about that there is uninvolved parenting. And this is the one on here, which I think really is pretty much itself already neglectful. But again, it's not necessarily because the parent is doesn't care about their child, doesn't want to provide guidance, nurturing, or attention. It may be that there is a parent who is dealing with an untreated depression, or they're dealing with just an overwhelming amount of stresses and lack of resources. And sometimes their parenting can end up looking like this because their capacity to provide that guidance and that nurturing and that attention is so low. And in any case, what the result is this child has very little emotional support. They don't have much warmth, and they kind of learn that, they're on their own, basically. And that's really scary for a child. At least in the permissive parenting, there's usually a friendliness and a warmth between the child and the parent. But in an uninvolved parent, it's kind of a combination of that. There's no rules. The kid is kind of on their own. And there's also none of that warmth and closeness with the parental figure. So what we talk about as the ideal or the correct parenting style is authoritative. And these are very broad because there's many ways to be an authoritative parent. There's many ways to be a good enough parent. But you need to have both of these two elements. You need to have that positive relationship with the child, and you need to be able to enforce rules. And you can see very quickly how it would become hard to do that if you are a parent who is in an abusive relationship with your co-parent. You might be able to have a positive environment, a positive relationship with your child, but that's going to be interrupted by the negative relationship with the other parent who is abusive. Or you might want to enforce some kind of rules and structure around your child, but you're constantly being undercut by this other parent who is setting themselves up as the powerful, controlling figure in the family. So I mentioned this partially to remind of our support group for people who did grow up with that dynamic in their homes, but also to remind us that there's many reasons why we may have grown up without what we call authoritative parenting, or what we call good enough parenting, or why we might have grown up with dynamics that harmed us or hurt us in some ways. Sometimes it can be very complex. There might be a parent who really is trying very hard, who cares a lot, but because of the challenges that they're dealing with, they're not able to provide everything that a child needs in their environment. So this is an example of some of the things that can happen in different types of parenting styles, but it's not a direct line all the time from one parenting style to a particular attachment style. And we also see that siblings growing up in the same family, they might actually get different parenting styles from their parents. We see this around gender a lot of the time, right? Where maybe the boys in the family, their parenting skews slightly more permissive, and then the girls skews more authoritarian. And part of that may even be because of fears about how women are treated. But the result is that you get these very big differences in how children within the same family experience the parenting of the caregiver. So the short story about attachment is that good enough parenting, or that authoritative parenting style, results in a secure attachment. A secure attachment just means that that child learns that they can rely on their parent. I can rely on my parent for emotional support. I can express my needs to them. And also, they're going to protect me from things that might harm me. They're not going to let me do things that are dangerous or are going to like spin out of control. And everything else, permissive parenting, uninvolved parenting, authoritarian parenting, results in an insecure attachment. And those insecure attachment styles can look different. And that's what we're going to talk about is those different styles, because many of us, for different reasons, because of the challenges our families were facing, intergenerational trauma, all sorts of reasons, many of us have some version of an insecure attachment. And I want to emphasize again that all of the insecure attachment styles do occur on a spectrum. So it's not as if every person who has the same type of insecure attachment style is going to have the same level of struggle. There can be worse. A person can be slightly insecure, medium insecure, or very insecure, and their behavior is going to look different. But depending on the type of insecure attachment style they have, the same themes are kind of going to show up over and over again. So first, the anxious attachment. This child learned that they need to be vigilant to maintain relationships. Oftentimes, this is somebody who grew up with a parent whose emotional needs were very present in the relationship. Maybe the parent was not very well able to regulate their own emotions. And so this child learned that, okay, I need to stay on top of how my mom or my dad or my grandma, whoever's caring for me, I need to stay on top of how they're feeling, because depending on how they're feeling, it could really affect my ability to get my needs met. And also, any change in emotion could lead to rejection or abandonment. This is obviously very stressful for a child, but it's not uncommon for children to become sensitive and really hyper attuned and hyper aware of their parents' needs and their emotions. And you'll often see this goes along with kids who you may have heard the term parentified child, like a child who kind of learned to behave as a parent either to their other siblings in order to relieve the burden from their parents, or even to behave kind of like a pseudo parent to their parent. So this might be a parent who is very isolated, and the only person that they have to talk to is their children. And so they start getting their emotional support from the child instead of the child getting the emotional support from the parent. So given these lessons, how might somebody who learned these lessons as a child, how might they behave when they get into a relationship as an adult? Again, you can unmute, raise your hand, or you can enter your response in the chat.
You can unmute and speak if you want. I think her hand is up, or is it still up? I don't know.
Yeah, I see Sada just raised her hand again.
Again,
So
okay,
you
yeah.
can
I wasn't sure
unmute
if it was
sorry.
and speak.
I think one thing that could come out from people who have an anxious attachment style in their relationships is they could tend to be emotionally abusive, in terms of being a little bit more controlling, or like in the case of like a parent-child anxious attachment with that codependency that can develop. You'd often see like that kind of mother-in-law, daughter-in-law dynamic when like a mother is too attached to their son. So it creates a little rift there a lot.
Thank you, Sada. So, you mentioned that it might be possible for someone with an anxious attachment to end up being abusive to their partners emotionally. And so this can happen on the very, very extreme ends of it, but it's less often that this person is going to be outright abusive, but they are going to be kind of intrusive, emotionally intrusive with their partner because they have so much anxiety about what their partner is feeling. So they might be constantly monitoring the partner's mood. Um, and this might be the type of person who like asks a lot, what's wrong, or insists that there's something wrong, even if it's not necessarily that. Or they might take it on themselves and say, oh, you must be mad at me because you have this expression, or you're looking a little like unhappy today.
We have another response in the chat. And it says they may feel anxious and at fault for the cause in the other person's emotion, and they might want to do whatever they can to please the other person and ignore their own needs.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the things that we note down that's really, really common for an anxiously attached partner is to constantly anticipate the needs of others, right? They learn to anticipate the needs of their caregiver when they were growing up. And so they keep doing that when they're an adult. And that has two negative results, right? The first thing is that they're always trying to mind read their partner. They're not actually communicating with the partner and hearing from the partner what the partner actually wants. But also because they're so used to anticipating others' needs, they're not used to communicating their own needs. But sometimes they may have this expectation that if this person really loves me, they should also be anticipating my needs all the time. And so this can create a lot of resentment in the relationship too, where it's not necessarily that the other partner was being neglectful or wasn't being caring, but the anxious partner has these really unrealistic expectations because of the unrealistic expectations they lived with growing up. I also mentioned something that you can call raising the bar. And this is because the anxious partner's anxiety about attachment goes beyond their specific relationship. And because they have this anxiety, they're going to keep trying to soothe it in different ways. And one of the ways that they might try to soothe it is that they kind of set up little tests for their partner, or they kind of interpret different things that happen in the relationship as if it's a test and their partner is either passing or failing. But because the anxiety doesn't actually stem from the partner, it stems from something that is much deeper in their childhood experience. Instead of feeling better when the partner passes the test, they'll keep kind of raising the bar a little bit. So this partner might say like, oh, you don't love me because you never get me flowers. And so then the partner starts getting them flowers a lot. And then they say, then it becomes about the type of the flowers or the timing of the flowers or something else. So it can seem like there's a legitimate conflict in the relationship, but the core of it with an anxiously attached partner is not about the specific thing that the partner is or isn't doing. It's because of the partner's anxiety overall, that if I'm not constantly perfectly anticipating your needs, if you're not constantly happy and smiley and just like lavishing adoration on me, then you must not really love me. And so this is a recipe for that person to feel exhausted because of all the effort that they're putting in to anticipate their partner's needs and make everything happen. And they, at the same time, are going to feel neglected because they are just putting in so much effort that is more than even a sort of securely attached partner is likely to put in. And the second reason why this happens is because it's very common for anxiously attached persons to pair up with avoidantly attached people. So they're usually also dealing with somebody who has a totally different perspective. So now we can look at avoidant attachment. So people who end up with an avoidant attachment style tend to learn that their needs are too much for others. They might have grown up with that uninvolved parent, or they may have grown up with a parent who was dealing with illness or like a chronic illness in the family, or there was just something going on in that family where the parent either made it obvious or the child was easily able to sense that that parent was getting overloaded. So that parent may or may not have been explosive or violent or like lacking in warmth, but repeatedly, more often than not, this child will have learned that they, like when they express their needs, they're not likely to get a good result. And so they learn that in order to maintain connection, they need to just avoid conflict and confrontation. And that the less they need or want, the smaller they can make themselves, the more self-sufficient they can be, the better chance they have of maintaining at least a neutral or maybe a positive relationship with their caregivers. You'll sometimes hear children who are actually in the process of developing an avoidant attachment being called an easy child because they're very quiet. You just entertain themselves, like you don't need to do much for them. That's not to say that all children who entertain themselves have an avoidant attachment, but oftentimes you'll see that dynamic with their caregivers, where the caregiver is like, oh, what a relief. I don't need to do very much for this child. And that kind of behavior of becoming smaller and avoiding expressing your own needs becomes what that child learns about how to have relationships with other people in general. So how might that person behave when they get into an adult relationship?
Hi, this is Annette. Sorry, I was driving earlier, so I couldn't really participate, and I've been dying to like finally park and speak. With this, I feel like they would obviously be more closed off and less trusting of other people. They wouldn't want to share as much. So even when it comes to partners, they wouldn't even be open to it. Like it's just like, no, no, I'm good. I got what I need. They fulfill the voids that they have, or they tell themselves that I'm fulfilling those voids in other ways. So I think being more career driven or being this or that, as opposed to thinking about a personal life just to protect one's feelings.
Thank you, Sana, and I'm glad that you safely pulled over and parked before you you chimed in, but I'm so glad that you could join us anyway. Um, that's a very good point, and it's very true actually that people who are on the more extreme ends of the avoidant attachment spectrum, they might not get into relationships at all, or when they do end up in a relationship, they might be very disengaged, they might be very detached, and they also might kind of throw themselves into their work. These are often the type of people who, if their partner is upset, they'll just assume that they need to give that person space, even if that's not what the person asked for. Um, because their go-to tactic is to retreat and to withdraw. And so they'll, at the same time, they're very unlikely to say what bothers them unless they get to a point where they're really overwhelmed by it. Or they might never say it and then they just kind of end the relationship without explaining that there were all these things that were going on that were bothering them. Um, they may also struggle to even identify what their own emotions and their needs were, because if they've learned from early childhood on that they should not express their needs because that's going to be too much for the people caring for them, they don't even get the chance to develop that ability to identify, what am I feeling? What do I want? So they might seem very passive when they do get into a relationship, and they might just sort of float along with whatever the other partner wants. And being disconnected might feel safer to them, even though it's also unsatisfying. They're not able to have this nice, strong connection that all people do crave on some level. The other thing that can happen is that they can feel, even if they are matched up with a secure partner, they may feel overwhelmed by that partner's needs, even when they're not at all unreasonable, just because they've kind of learned to suppress all their needs, and that's what you do in order to make life easy for the person that you love. And so to them, somebody who is actively expressing their needs is going to feel really overwhelming. That said, I mentioned before that it's really, really common to see anxious people and avoidant people pair up together, because both of them are actually attracted to something in this other person. It's like between the two of them, they create that balance in the relationship, even though each of them is very imbalanced on their own. So the avoidant partner may really appreciate that the anxious partner like really tries to draw them out and keeps asking them, what are you feeling? What's going on with you? They may appreciate like the sort of hyper communication of the anxious partner at first. And then as they're in relationship over a longer period of time, it's going to start to feel overwhelming and too much. And likewise, the anxious partner may find the avoidant partner to be really calm, really kind of soothing. They're not having these big emotional ups and downs that the anxious partner was used to dealing with. But then again, as they spend longer time to each other, they tend to trigger those insecurities that each of them have, and it becomes more pronounced, and the negative cycles start to happen in that relationship. And I like to bring up this pairing because it is one of the really sort of classic examples of how a relationship can get really, really off kilter and be very unhappy and unsatisfying to both partners without either partner necessarily being horrible or mean to the other partner. It's just because they're dealing with these really intense insecurities that are kind of at odds with one another. So now I'm mentioning the third type of insecure attachment. And this also tends to be just on the more extreme end of the spectrum. It's disorganized attachment. This is somebody who did grow up in an environment where there was abuse or neglect of some kind. It's usually an environment that was extremely chaotic and unpredictable. There might even have been substance abuse, or there might have been an untreated severe mental illness that made the caregiver very unpredictable. But in any case, as a child, this person learns that caregivers are unpredictable. They may be affectionate one moment, and they might hurt me the next moment, and then they might neglect me. So to protect themselves, they learn that they need to be unpredictable too. If they try lots of different things, sometimes their needs are going to be met, even though they also expect that generally most of the time their needs shouldn't be met. And the big lesson that they learn is that past kindness is not proof of future care. So just because my caregiver is good to me one day or affectionate to me one day does not mean that they're going to continue caring for me and they're going to continue loving me. And that also leaves that person with this underlying feeling that they themselves are not worthy of love or care. Because one of the other things that's really important when we're thinking about these early experiences is that when we are very young, our understanding of the world really revolves around ourselves. So if something is going on with our parents, we tend to interpret it as our fault. And part of this is a survival mechanism because we depend on our caregivers for our survival. So if they're unhappy, then we try to fix it because we don't want them to be unhappy. We want to be able to keep depending on them for care. And so when the parents are very, very disordered, you'll see the child taking on this really tragic idea that they are not worthy of care because they're still thinking in that kind of framework that comes from our survival mechanism to bond with our caregivers. So saying all of that, how might you expect somebody with a disorganized attachment to behave in relationships as an adult?
I'll chime in. This is Sana again. With a lot of trust issues, a lot of I don't think you're going to be there when you think, you know, that you tell someone to be there and you're just constantly feeling that they're not going to show up. A lot of that kind of, or what's more important, or always assuming, unfortunately, the worst. So yeah.
Yeah, I think those are some really good examples. Any other ideas of other facets of how somebody with a disorganized attachment might behave in an adult relationship?
I think adding on to what Sana said, they can be really suspicious of their partner or other people's like intentions, and they can tend to be inconsistent with their own relationships and also often fear abandonment.
Yeah, those are really, really great points, Sara. All right, and I think I see.
Yeah, we have 2 responses in the chat. Somebody said both avoidant and anxious. And then the another person said feeling like they're too much or a burden on the other person.
Yeah, those are both really true, and it is part of why it's called disorganized attachment is because this person will sometimes certain behaviors are going to look more like the extreme ends of anxious. Certain behaviors are going to look more like the extreme end of avoidant. And there's actually there's somebody I couldn't figure out how to incorporate into our presentation, but I saw that I see your question, so I'm going to come back to it in a moment. But there was a graphic for disorganized attachment that kind of showed a little like ball kind of ping-ponging all over the place from like anxious, avoidant, different types of anxious and avoidant insecure attachment, that this is somebody who kind of seems really all over the place. So we actually are going to have a note about this question later, but I'll address it now. So Sada asked if people can exhibit qualities of more than one attachment style based on different experiences. So in fact, I'll just skip ahead to that slide and then come back. Yes, our attachment styles can be influenced by context. So the only thing is that our core attachment style that we have from those early childhood experiences is going to be the underlying theme for us. But there may be relationships we have which do not trigger those anxieties or insecurities as much as others. So that's why I mentioned that really significant relationships are the ones where our attachment style is really likely to show up. But we may be able to have friendships or working relationships where attachment style doesn't really show up that much because maybe our insecurity isn't so severe that it's going to be triggered in those relationships. But also, we can be influenced by those experiences that we have after childhood. So if we end up in a relationship with a disorganized partner, that person can actually make us feel destabilized and make us less secure over time because we're now in that environment, which is really unpredictable and insecure. And similarly, you can see that as well with very anxious or very avoidant partners, that sometimes somebody who is maybe not that anxious, mostly secure, but a little bit more towards the anxious side of the spectrum. If they have a very avoidant partner, they might become more anxious because of the extreme level of that person's detachment. And then, of course, we can all work on becoming more secure over time. And that's what the second half of our discussion is going to be about. So I will come back to that. But for now, just revisiting how the disorganized partner shows up in relationships. They crave connection too, but they fear it. And so they'll often have this sort of push and pull dynamic with partners where they might be doing really like dramatic things, giving a lot of attention to their partner, really saying, beautiful things about them to pull them in, and then they might push them away out of that fear of rejection and abandonment. And both of those behaviors, even though they're opposite from one another and they're so extreme, they're coming from the same place of fear. Like, I need to really go over the top to make this person want me because, like, I believe that nobody would want me just for myself. And then also, because I'm so afraid they're going to hurt me, I need to push them away once they actually start to get close to me. And for this person, chaos and conflict may actually feel most familiar to them. Even if it doesn't necessarily feel safe, this is something that they've been living in for a long time. That's what they know how to deal with. And so they may sort of like seem to pick fights or blow up at random. So the video will be, the webinar is recorded, so you will be able to review it online after we finish tonight and post it online. And so extreme, and they also often have extreme reactions to triggers that would seem minor to those of us that are more secure, because in the environment that they grew up in, really minor things had major consequences for them. And we mentioned, I think Sara mentioned before, like whether there's an attachment style that is associated more so with abuse. And I want to be clear that most people who experience abuse growing up do not grow up to abuse other people. So even if you have a disorganized attachment, that doesn't follow that you are going to abuse your partners. In fact, you may very often be victimized in your relationships too. But it is true that people who end up abusing their partners, very often they're having a more extreme end of the disorganized attachment spectrum. This is how they end up with these really strange behaviors that don't make sense to other people. And they may attempt to control their partners to deal with that fear. They may end up with that belief that if I control my partner, then I can feel safe and I can feel secure. Or they may reject partners entirely, believing that nobody can be trusted. And they also might engage in sort of like fawning behaviors, again, out of that same belief that they're not worthy deep down because of how they were treated in their early years. And this person will spend a lot of the time feeling really afraid and out of control. Regardless of how they show up to other people, some people with a disorganized attachment will share that they feel scared, will share that they feel vulnerable, may seem very helpless, and other people will present as being very kind of tough and strong and like, I know how not to get taken advantage of kind of thing. But all of them are experiencing this feeling of just immense fear and lack of control that ties back to those early childhood experiences. And I will say for this person, learning to feel more secure and behave in a more secure manner with their partners can be very, very difficult. It can feel really scary, really overwhelming. And so while, as a therapist, I'm always recommending therapy for everyone, but particularly for somebody with a disorganized attachment, therapy might be one of the only places that they really can safely practice being vulnerable, because a disorganized partner's behaviors are going to be very taxing on another partner. And so they're going to kind of learn things that confirm their beliefs, because when they behave in these like erratic and unpredictable ways with their partners, eventually those relationships are often going to end. And that's going to confirm their belief that nobody can love me, I'm just too damaged, I'm too terrible. And so actually for them to have a space, a kind of intermediate space with a professional who is going to continue to look at the good in them consistently, and who is not actively in a relationship with them where they could be harmed by those behaviors, is going to be very important. So finally, we're on the secure attachment, which is what we're all aiming for in our relationships and in ourselves. And if we're parents, this is what we're aiming for with our children. The person who has a secure attachment learned, my caregivers will meet my needs most of the time. And it's actually important that the caregiver is meeting their needs most of the time, not all the time, because this person has the experience that, okay, if one day my mom is less responsive, or one day my dad is a little more grumpy, it doesn't mean that like my relationship with my parent is over and I can't depend on them anymore. It just means that they're having a bad day, but probably tomorrow things will be better. And that's important for a child to learn, because as we grow up, we need to be able to have that understanding with our partners as well. We can't be so intent that everything has to be perfect all the time, or we're not going to be secure. We're actually going to be very insecure. This person also learned that it's safe for them to express their needs and emotions, even negative ones. It was okay for them to say things that were maybe negative, or to say they felt angry in their home environment, and those emotions were validated and allowed, even though there were still limits on what kind of behaviors were acceptable. And they also learned that even if I have a conflict with my caregiver, they're not going to abandon or reject me. So they are not going to be so afraid of conflicts. They have learned that, sometimes you need to have a conflict, but the relationship can still continue. So with a secure attachment, how do you behave in an adult relationship?
That's like the $1 million question that someone like myself who's been in therapy for years is still trying to learn. So obviously, like, looking at those healthy relationships where, you know what, you give them the benefit of the doubt, there's more of that trust, there's more of that give and take, there's more of that um, frequent communication, and being able to understand partners' needs and also explain your needs and have both of them met.
Perfect. Exactly. This person with a secure attachment can express their needs clearly. Oh, I see. Mia also said being open and
Yeah.
comfortable expressing yourself, being authentic. Yes, this person has learned that it's safe to be themselves. It's safe to ask for what they need, say what they need. Um, they are able to see that conflicts are problems to address. They're not necessarily a disaster. They don't mean the end of the relationship. And at the same time, their sense of self doesn't depend on the relationship. So if there is something really wrong with that relationship and it's not working for them, it's not safe for them, they're able to end it without believing that this means that no one will ever love them, or, their life is over. And they can be present with emotions, their own emotions and their partner's emotions, without getting overwhelmed or defensive. And again, you can see these are like foundations. It doesn't mean that this person, because they have a secure attachment, they're a perfect communicator, they know all the right words to say, that they're always super loving. It just means that they are secure enough to be able to communicate with their partner, and that gives them the strength and the foundation that they need to build a healthy relationship with another partner who is similarly healthy. When they get paired up with somebody who has an insecure attachment, depending on how extreme that is, they may help the other person move a little bit more towards secure, but also that partner, depending on how extreme their insecurities are, they might move that person in the other direction for a little bit. But because they have this secure attachment from their entire childhood, it's going to be much easier for this person to recover after leaving a relationship that was destabilizing or unhealthy than it would be for somebody who didn't have that foundation to start off with. So, as we said, we can become more secure over time, and that is what we are kind of looking for. But we always have to remember that becoming more secure is not, when we're working on our attachment style, we're talking about our own emotional health. But when we're talking about having a secure connection in our relationship, only half of that depends on us. So the results, you can see that, having a secure attachment doesn't guarantee that this person is only going to end up in healthy relationships, but it does mean that they're going to know what to do to get toward a healthy place with their partners, and they're more likely to figure out when this relationship is not going to be healthy for them. So how do we become more secure? We have some keywords on here, but I'd still like to hear from you kind of what your initial ideas are about how we can become more secure if we didn't grow up with that secure attachment in our family of origin. So Mia has said therapy. Amina has mentioned neuroplasticity, which is really just our ability to be able to change over time, having a growth mindset. Sanat has raised her hand.
Yeah, I was gonna say one thing that obviously all of these things are incredible, but also if there's a fear that you have and trying to face it head on, like for example, and I'll use a personal one, a fear of swimming. And so like facing that fear head on and trying to learn how to swim has somehow helped kind of build more of that inner trust, inner power, inner safety, and that leaks into other relationships of feeling like, okay, I got my power back. So physical
That,
things sometimes could help.
that's an excellent example, because actually a lot of what you're practicing when you're trying to become more secure is about facing your fears about relationships, your fears about what will happen if I speak up for myself, what will happen um, if I say what I actually need, or I tell my partner when I'm upset, or uh, if I don't constantly serve my partner and anticipate their every need, what will happen? And so it's one big piece of what you're practicing is kind of doing the opposite of what those fearful instincts are telling us to do, and saying like, this is the only way to maintain this relationship. That might not be true. So the reason why we put safety in the number one spot at the top of the circle is because um, if we're trying to teach ourselves to be more secure and to feel more confident, we need to be doing that in a safe environment. That doesn't mean it has to be perfect, it has to be comfortable, it has to be free of conflict, but it does need to be safe. So, like, if I am in a relationship with a partner who is abusive to me or violent, it makes sense that I'm afraid to speak up about my needs or to change the dynamics of the relationship, because there really could be some dangerous consequences for me if I change what I'm doing within that relationship. Obviously, my recommendation as a therapist and as somebody working in the field of trying to end gender-based violence, my recommendation is not just stay in that relationship and keep doing what you're doing, but the recommendation is that you're not going to find that safety with that partner, and you're not going to be able to practice those skills with that partner. It's going to have to happen somewhere else. And you might need, again, the support of a therapist, a professional, an organization in order to find a safe way out of that relationship.
We have another comment as well as a question that I got directly, but I'll read the comment first. Finding something that makes you feel fulfilled, understanding your uniqueness, and working with a professional or seeking support like therapy, which are all good answers. The question that I got was, I also wonder about reparenting an insecure child. If a parent has made past mistakes, how can they support a child to still leave the child securely attached?
So, okay, so it's interesting you use the question, use the term reparenting, because often the term reparenting is used in therapy not to describe the parent doing something new over time, but actually something that you do with yourself to practice giving yourself the experience of a relationship with a secure caregiver. But what a parent can do when there has been a rupture in childhood, like perhaps this is a parent who grew up with um, very few resources. They know that there were things about their parenting or about the dynamics in the home that were either out of control or unhealthy for the child. And so the big thing for that parent is, if the child is still in relationship with them and that child is still open to discussing these things, is to start being that secure parent now. So validating the child's emotions, even though they might be painful, right? That adult child might be saying, you're the reason why I'm messed up. You're the reason why I can't have a good relationship now. And that's going to be really painful. And you don't have to agree with everything that they're saying, but if you can still have the ability to provide emotional support to validate that, like, you didn't get to be the parent you wanted to be with them, or they didn't get the kind of parenting that they needed, that is going to go a very long way. It's not going to undo what happened in the past, but that can be very, very healing for that adult child, because at least they're getting the validation that what was happening in their childhood was not normal, and that they don't have to accept that as the normal thing to expect from their other future relationships. But if there is a parent and child who are kind of working through this stuff together, I would suggest seeking family therapy support for that, because it can be very intense. And oftentimes the adult who was that parent, there may be a lot of reasons why their parenting didn't turn out the way that it needed to be. And very often that parent is carrying a lot of their own trauma and pain. And so they need a place as well to get support with that. And it cannot come from the child. So, kind of zooming back out to the big question of how we can all work on becoming more secure. We mentioned practice. A lot of people mentioned therapy. And then a big part of it that you might do in therapy or in your practice is reflection. You may have noticed in the insecure attachment styles, because there's so much anxiety over what's going on with the parents, these people have not learned to pay attention to their own needs, either because they're constantly anticipating other people's needs, or they're anticipating disaster, or they're just learning not to have too many needs in order to preserve the relationship. So a lot of us who are struggling to become more secure in our adulthood, we need to do a lot of reflection and getting to know ourselves better, because oftentimes we didn't learn that in childhood, and really practice getting to know what emotions am I feeling instead of just feeling kind of confused or overwhelmed in the moment. So that's kind of the first place where we start is self-knowledge. Practicing checking in with yourself. What do I need? What am I feeling? Where does that feeling come from? I'm starting off with all the things that you can do on your own. You don't need to be in a relationship, or if you're in a relationship, you don't need to be doing these things with your partner. But these are things that you can do to get to a place where you're able to engage in those behaviors that match up with a secure attachment style. Learning emotional regulation skills. This is not to suppress our emotions further or to become more easy for our partner to deal with, but very often, if we have an insecure attachment, we're going to be having really intense emotional responses because we're having this fear of abandonment or rejection or like a disastrous conflict with our caregiver is then showing up in the present with our partner. And so we do need to learn techniques and practice techniques that help us to soothe ourselves most of the time and also in the moment. And also we need to learn to be able to parse out like, am I having this strong emotional reaction right now because of what's happening in this moment? Or is this a trauma reaction? Or is it a little bit of both? And then really getting to know, am I ready to talk about this with my partner right now, or do I need time first? Because sometimes, like somebody with an anxious attachment will often feel like this has to be resolved right away in this moment. But they're very activated and very much in their fight or flight mode when that happens. And it's not necessarily the best time for them to discuss what's going on. They might need to practice taking a beat and taking some time before they go into addressing whatever it is that's wrong or that feels wrong to them. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the person with the avoidant attachment may need to push themselves to talk about things a little earlier, but they also might need to learn to ask for the time that they need so that they can understand what's going on in order to talk about it. And if they have an anxious partner, they might need to do something so that the anxious partner can trust that, okay, we really are going to talk about it. Maybe we're going to talk about it tomorrow at this time. And then the anxious partner needs to kind of be able to sit with that and agree, okay, I have to be able to wait until tomorrow to talk about this with my partner, because if I try to talk about it with them right now, they're not even going to know what they're feeling because it's going to take them a while to process what exactly is going on, because they've learned to suppress things so much that it's not going to be easy for them to say, this is what I feel in this exact moment. For all of these things, if you have thoughts or questions, please feel free to chime in. So learning self-compassion is kind of connects to this question of reparenting. When we have developed an insecure attachment, very often our inner voice that we learned is not so nice. Either it's very dismissive, or it might even be harsh. But the person who has a secure attachment usually has internalized a very kind, loving, responsive voice that is the response that they used to get from their caregiver. So when we practice self-compassion and we practice speaking to ourselves in a kind voice, we practice validating our emotions, even when they feel irrational, but we kind of start off from a place of, okay, this is what I'm feeling. I'm not going to try to dismiss it right away or fix it, but I'm just going to notice that this is how I'm feeling. And we even kind of can ask ourselves, how would I treat a friend? And then kind of give that response to ourselves, or even think of a small child and what response would we give to a small child. That might help stir up in us the kind of tone and words that we should be starting to internalize for ourselves. And the more we practice that, the more we're going to be able to respond to our own emotions and our own anxieties with that kind of soothing inner voice. And that will also make it easier for us to deal with the various conflicts and challenges that come with being in relationship and in interaction with other people. So now kind of moving into the territory of things that you can do when you are in a relationship with another person. You can ask yourself about what are the boundaries and responsibilities that should be in this relationship. First, you need to know your own limits. And the limits might be something like the avoidant partner, knowing that, okay, it takes me longer to understand what emotions I'm feeling. So I'm not going to push myself to respond immediately, but I'm going to ask for some time, and then I'm going to kind of try to honor the time that I use and really reflect on it. And also, we need to be really clear on what is my responsibility and what is my partner's responsibility. So this can go wrong in both directions, right? Like if I think that it's my partner's responsibility to cure my anxiety, I'm going to put a lot on them all the time to constantly reassure me and, pass all my tests. And that's going to feel very taxing and exhausting on my partner. And it's not going to make them feel very loved. It's going to make them feel like they're under some level of like suspicion and distrust. But at the same time, if my partner is expecting me to be responsible for things that are their issue, right? Like if my avoidant partner is saying that I just need to not need any emotional support from them, then that's kind of unfair too, right? So we need to have a sense of kind of a balance in the responsibilities that we hold in the relationship. And we need to be clear on which things really belong to us and which things we need to work on and which things our partner kind of needs to own, and also which things we need to work on together if we want to have a strong relationship. And all of these questions are also the types of things that can help you determine if this relationship is going toward a healthy place, or is your partner really stuck on the idea that everything is your responsibility, or that nothing is their responsibility. That might be something that is not a good sign for the future if they can't be flexible on that and kind of learn to take responsibility for some things that they've been putting off. We also want to be really clear in our communication. And that's why it's so important to have that foundation of self-knowledge. If we are not able to be specific in our requests, it's going to be a lot harder for our partner to successfully give us what we want. And when we're kind of expecting our partner to read our minds, we're setting them up for failure. And we're also reducing how much intimacy is actually in the relationship. Because if I'm just anticipating my partner's needs all the time, even if I get it right like 80% of the time, that means that there's things that my partner might want or need that he or she is not expressing to me, because they're just used to me kind of jumping in and doing it ahead of time. And finally, we need to remember that to kind of separate out what we need to feel secure in ourselves and what we need to feel secure in the relationship. So things that we need to feel secure in the relationship are connection with our partner, that mutual respect, support, and understanding, all of those things are key to feeling secure in our relationship with that specific person. But we cannot put our ability to feel secure in ourselves completely on that other person. And so when we're kind of dealing with conflicts or times when emotions are running high, we need to ask ourselves, is this something that I need to feel secure in the relationship? Or is this something I need to feel secure in myself? And that's also going to give us some insight about whose responsibility that thing is and where we kind of need to focus our attention. Similarly, we talked about having kind of outside emotional responses because of those instinctive or traumatic fears. In order to become secure, the number one thing we need to practice is just slowing down so that we can tell what's going on internally and we can understand what's going on in the relationship or in the moment and be really clear on what's happening before responding. So we're not just reacting out of our instinctive fears or what we learned in childhood, but we're slowing our system down enough and slowing the moment down enough to be able to have that clear communication internally and with our partner. And finally, we can even work on how we're sort of framing what happens in the relationship. So we might feel tempted to say something to our partner like, you never say you love me. You like just never say it, and it's I hate it, or I feel so bad about it. That is going to come across to our partner like a criticism. It's already like a negative thing, it's an accusation, and they might automatically start to feel defensive or insecure. But if we can think about, okay, what's my wish? What am I asking for when I make this criticism? Then we might be able to express it in a way that there's a higher chance that that person will be able to hear it. Like we might say, you know, I would really love it if you would tell me how you feel about me. I would really love to hear that from you in words. It would mean a lot to me. It still might be hard for that partner. It might not come naturally to them. They still can have all the kinds of different responses to it, but they're less likely to off the bat feel defensive and try to start arguing with you if you just are expressing to them that like you love them and you want to hear more about how they feel about you. And similarly, when we're working on ourselves and our ability to kind of soothe ourselves and regulate our emotions, we might be able to listen when our partner is expressing something as a criticism. We might be able to listen and hear what is the wish behind that criticism, right? So, like if our partner is saying, "Oh, you're always on your phone, like you never spend any time with me." Our first instinct might be to say, "What? I checked my screen time app and it tells me that I'm down like 40%, and I'm not on my phone that much." Our first instinct might be to respond that way, but if we are able to slow down, we might be able to say, it sounds like my partner is saying that he wants to spend more time with me or she wants to spend more time with me. They want to feel more connected to me. And that's a good thing, right? Our partner wants to be connected with us. So we might be able to start from a more calm, generous place if we respond to the wish behind the criticism. And of course, then after that point, you'll see where that conversation goes or what happens when you keep trying to interrupt that cycle multiple times over. Maybe, your partner is going to go down that road of saying, you must be talking to somebody else and getting really suspicious. And then you have kind of more information about what's going on with this partner and how difficult it might be for them to behave in a healthy and safe way with you. But if you can do some of these small shifts during those times when you're feeling more confused about the relationship or you do think that it's possible to work on, it may help you to get that clarity in whether, okay, I think when I see myself doing this work on my side of the road, I see some shifts happening in my relationship. Or you might say, I've been doing work on my side of the road for like months, and I'm either getting no movement from my partner or no or negative reactions from them. And that gives you information as well about what you might want for the future. And again, I do want to emphasize safety. Even in a relationship that is not abusive or unsafe, doing something different can be startling or jarring, and can cause more conflict at the beginning, or may cause may escalate emotions. So it is a good idea, if you are planning to try something different, to actually tell your partner that that's what you're doing, because it might not seem natural at first, and they might have a strange reaction to you using different words or responding in a different way. But if this is an environment where there is where you have a lack of safety, where there has been violence or there are threats of violence, then it might not be safe to practice some of these techniques with your partner. And so, if you are confused about that, if that isn't a concern for you, then we really hope that you would reach out to Pillars of Peace, either at our helpline or at the help email address, and get some support.
We have
So,
two questions in the chat. Yeah. First one was, what does it mean if someone with a secure attachment style is drawn to someone with an avoidant attachment style? And then should I say the second one, or do you want to answer that one first?
I can answer that one first. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. If you find that you are repeatedly being drawn to people with an avoidant attachment style, you might not have a secure attachment style. You might more likely have an anxious attachment style. But if you are really secure and you just ended up with a more avoidant partner, it may just mean that you need to do a little more work together, and that partner needs to do a little more work in order to get to a place where they can be vulnerable and they can be kind of engaged in that relationship. But I will say that sometimes we're not the best at identifying what our own attachment style is. There's all sorts of online quizzes and that sort of thing, of variable accuracy. But if we're repeatedly drawn to people with avoidant attachment styles, it's much more likely that we have some level of anxious in our attachment than that we have a secure attachment.
And then oh yeah, well, the follow-up question, actually I'll put that in order, I guess. But
Yeah.
the next question was, what if a partner was asking you to express your needs or tried, but you avoided responding? I guess, how do you move?
Yeah. So if you avoided responding, so that might be a sign. It's not necessarily true, because you cannot kind of diagnose an attachment style based on one incident or one behavior. But it might be that you were somebody who didn't grow up feeling safe expressing your needs, or you didn't know what your needs were. So if this is something that has happened to you in your relationship, and you're still in this relationship, you can still work on it. You can still go back to that partner after the fact and say, I've thought about it some more. I couldn't really articulate it at the time, but this is what I think I need, or this is what I think I'm feeling. And if you're not in that relationship anymore, you would want to work harder on that piece of self-knowledge and getting to know what your needs are and getting to know what your feelings are.
And the last question is, what's the best way to find out what our attachment style is? But I feel like you just answered that as well.
Yeah, so it's not an online quiz. It may be most helpful in the end I don't want to say that you have to go into therapy in order to find out what your attachment style is, but you definitely want to be able to look at the big picture. You want to look at what were my experiences with my caregivers? How does that match up with what I'm doing now? And kind of look at if there have been patterns in your relationships, if you've had multiple relationships or if you've had a relationship over a longer period of time, kind of look for the patterns, because your attachment style is not going to be something that just showed up in one situation or in one incident. It's going to be like the pattern of how you behave in those in relationship with other people. So it's especially in this setting, I can't like tell everyone what your attachment style is, but if you're curious to learn more about it, I also would encourage you again to reach out to Pillars of Peace. If you live in New York State, we are able to offer free trauma sensitive therapy to survivors of any form of gender-based violence. So that includes we're including people who witnessed domestic violence in their home growing up, as well as people who have experienced domestic violence, forced marriage, FGM, trafficking, sexual assault, anything that falls under that umbrella. And so if you're kind of interested in exploring this more and you're not already in therapy, or you're struggling to find therapists who kind of understands you and your background, then we would really encourage you to reach out to us.
And then we have another question. Are there any books you suggest reading for more self-awareness?
So the most frequently recommended one is recommended for a reason. The Body Keeps the Score. This is really key for just kind of understanding how our bodies and our brains hold on to our experiences. I do not recommend that book Attached, which has become very popular. There's a very weird current in a lot of popular discussions of, yes, Tamanna is showing us the book. But there's a sort of weird undercurrent in a lot of spaces that are talking about attachment, where they kind of demonize the avoidant attachment style and make the anxious attachment style seem better, or if it's more secure, and it's really not. Avoidant and anxious are both types of insecure attachment. But I would say that online, there's an account called The Secure Relationship that I kind of find to be, has very good, like, simple graphics that illustrate attachment issues and concerns, and she's pretty good about being sensitive to issues like abuse, and it's very balanced in her representations of the different styles. It's not an endorsement of everything she ever posts, but I think that's one resource on attachment that is pretty good and is very accessible and free since it's online. But most of the self-awareness, I think, books that you could read, I don't have specific titles, but I think anything that allows you to practice checking in with yourself. So really more like journaling practices, doing regular body scans, things like that are going to help with starting to build up a little bit more self-awareness and body awareness as well. I think we now need to do some sort of book club webinar where we are prepared with a list of recommendations and maybe can discuss them. So thank you for that question and ideas for future events as well. We really appreciate all of you joining us this evening. We're going to hang out here until 7:30 if you have more questions, but you're definitely free to leave at this point if you do not. And as Tamanna has said, keep checking up on our either our Linktree link, or you can access that through our Instagram profile or our website, so that you can sign up for the support group. You can find about future events. And also, I think, for those who are interested in and are able to comfortably make a donation to support our work in assisting survivors, Tamanna can share the donate link as well. And also those who are, every time we run one of these webinars, we see that there's a number of people who are coming from helping professions. And so we do want to let you know that we're hiring in a number of different areas. So check out our website, check out our Linktree for descriptions of the openings that we have available. And just, reach out to us, whatever it is, whether you're interested in joining in the work or you're interested in getting some support. We'd love to hear from you.
Do you want to take that last? Okay, yeah. Okay, so do you have any tips for dealing with rejection or the severance of a relationship if one has an insecure attachment style?
So this is actually a really good question that we probably should have included in our presentation, but although it was already so long. It's really hard to deal with the end of a relationship when you have an insecure attachment style, because it can really tend to bring up those underlying beliefs about unworthiness, about not being able to expect another person to care for you, even unless you are constantly serving and anticipating them, or unless you're making yourself really small, or unless you kind of are constantly trying to keep ahead of whatever their next move is. So the first thing that I would say, besides, again, reaching out to your supports and considering therapy, if you notice that when a relationship ends, it completely makes you question everything about your own self, your life, your self-worthiness, is to really try to separate those things out for yourself and notice, like, remember, this is a relationship that ended with an individual person. It really hurts. Be mindful and validating of the emotions that you're feeling, but also keep challenging thoughts that you might have that say, I'm always going to be alone. This proves that no one is going to stick with me. Everyone's going to abandon me. Really be aware of those kind of thoughts that come up, and remember that those are not coming from the relationship. It's not because the breakup is proof that that traumatic belief is true. It's just that whenever you experience rejection or abandonment, because you had those early experiences, it brings up those ideas. Thank you for asking and for joining us. We really appreciate all the contributions that we've gotten. Your questions and insights have enriched the discussion, and it's always such a pleasure to hear from a number of people whenever we put on these webinars. And so we hope, if your schedule allows, that you'll join us again next week and for our future last 2 Tuesdays webinars.
Yeah, registration for the next webinar next Tuesday is in our Linktree as well. Everything is on our Linktree. So just save that link and you should be good.
I'm going to stop the recording, but we'll still be here for the last few moments if you have more questions.